chapter 6 of All Quiet on the Western Front. I figured I would go ahead and try to do a few more chapters for you. Following Kat and Paul's kind of moment after catching the geese and cooking them and having a nice meal, and Paul kind of explaining to us the way that he feels about Kat. We now come to chapter 6, where the first line even tells us, is there are rumors of an offensive. And they have to go up to the front earlier than they usually do. And as they are heading out, we see this really, really ominous picture that foreshadows the results of this journey to the front that they're going to. And as they pass by, they go by a schoolhouse, and in front of the schoolhouse are stacked all of these coffins that are freshly made. They're so newly made, they haven't even been polished yet, they haven't been stained, and it's just like fresh cut wood in long boxes. A really, really simple coffins. And there's a lot of irony here and a lot of juxtaposition. Remember that juxtaposition is kind of that contrast of two things to highlight qualities of one or the other items. And here you have this schoolhouse that represents innocence and childhood and just kind of that life that Paul and his comrades had earlier. And stacked in front of it, you have all these coffins that represent death and kind of their future in a way. Remark is showing us that, here they came from this innocence and this hope of their future in a schoolhouse, and now their only future is death. And they're so hastily made, it's not even a respectable death or an honorable death. It's not these beautiful coffins that cost a lot of money, but there's just simple wooden boxes that have been thrown together really quickly. And even it says foreshadowing, it says symbolism that's kind of thrown in our faces. And even the comrades, Paul and his friends, realize this. Mueller kind of comments, he's like, oh, well, that's good preparation for an offensive. He knows what's about to happen. There's no hope for them whatsoever. And Dietering's trying to hold on to hope and says, oh, they're not for us. They're not for us. Don't worry about it. And Kat tries to, kind of calm it all down. But it shows that, they had to build them so quickly. They build 100 of these coffins really quickly. They don't stain them. It's just freshly thrown together wooden boxes to put bodies in so that the bodies don't rot and they have something to send home or something to bury rather than just having body pieces blown all over the front. They arrive at the front and they notice that the English army, the English artillery is much, much better than their own. And they notice this really, really rapidly. And it's so much so that, the barrels of their guns are not functioning properly, and their bullets aren't going as far, their artillery isn't going as far, because they have been on the front so often. Paul says his own unit this is the third time in 4 weeks that they've been to the front, which is significant for this time. They didn't have time to rest, they didn't have time to mend any weapons, they didn't have time to fix anything. It was just, you're home for a little while, you're back on the front, you're home for a little while, you're back on the front. It was very, very exhausting, and that becomes dangerous in and of itself. And he tells us at the end of page 100 that he said, tonight 2 of our own men are wounded, and they're probably wounded by their own guns or the significant greater strength of the English artillery. I've mentioned before, and I want you to notice here, that the way that Paul kind of goes between this narrative of reality and narrative of just kind of straightforwardness of things actually going on, and then all of a sudden he seems to change a bit, and he has this narrative that is very poetic and very beautiful. And I think that kind of shows us the way that his brain is functioning, his mind is functioning at this time, where he goes through moments of clear-headedness and rationality, and then when things start to catch up with him mentally and emotionally, that's when he slips into these kind of poetic times when he's reflecting and realizing where he is in his life, and the fact that, he's on the front lines and he's battling a fight that he doesn't even see a purpose in. And he describes at this point, it's on page 101 in my book. At this point, he describes the front as a cage. He says, the front is a cage in which we must await fearfully whatever may happen. We lie under the network of arching shells, live in a suspense of uncertainty. Over us chance hovers. If a shot comes, we can duck. That is all. We neither know nor can determine where it will fall. It is in this chance that makes us undifferent. A few months ago, I was sitting in a dugout playing scat. After a while, I stood up and went to visit some friends to another dugout. On my return, nothing more was to be seen of the first one. It had been blown to pieces by a direct hit. I went back to the second and arrived just in time to lend a hand in digging it out. In the interval, it had been buried. They believe and they put their faith and their trust in chance, because it's not how skilled you are, it's not how knowledgeable you are, it's how lucky you are. And Paul has been very, very lucky at this point. And he believes that every soldier believes in chance, and that is our greatest hope is chance. Just that luck, that chance that they have to survive. He tells about the rats, how numerous they are becoming, and what a nuisance they are, and how big they are. But he kind of sees it as a chance to keep their mind off the front a bit, and it gets kind of a little bit gruesome. They set up traps to try to catch the rats, and guys, these are massive rats. If you go and Google or look up trench rats, they're not these like little teeny tiny things. They're fairly big. And they cause a lot of trouble. If you lay down too long, they can start nibbling on your fingers and toes, and they ate the food. And then he says that on page 103 that they get an order of cheese. A lot of people who don't understand are saying, oh, this is great, we get nice, good food. But what Paul tries to explain to us is that this cheese is a sign that bad times are coming. The kitchen is trying to rid itself of all the food that it has, because it knows it's not going to be able to use it all when so few men return. They're anticipating not everyone returning, and so in an attempt to not let the food go to waste, they're sending more and more to the front, and Paul recognizes that. Paul talks to us about the weapons that they use. He says the bayonets are out of style now with the soldiers, because it could easily, if you stabbed it in the wrong way, it could get stuck on someone's rib cage. And he's explaining this very, very matter-of-factly, like, oh yeah, you don't want a bayonet. Instead, he says that they want a sharpened spade. Because a spade, if you hit the person in the right way, he said if you hit between the neck and the shoulders, would be here, you could, cleave right through someone's body and kill them in one shot or one hit. Where with the bayonet, if you stuck a man in his ribs, it could get caught on his rib cages, and then you spend more time trying to yank the bayonet out than you would a spade that would just go a clean cut through. He said, or you run and you throw bombs, and that's the easiest way to attack the enemy. They experience gas, they put on their masks, and they face the gas. They're starting to realize how serious this is going to be. They don't think they're going to survive very long, and that they're not going to make it out. And several days pass, and things seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. But the rations get better and better, and that's because, like I said before, that the kitchens are trying to clear all the food that they have, so that they will have. It's not going to go to waste when not as many men come back. They experience more and more bombardment, shells exploding, things like that, and the trenches are getting filled with dirt, meaning that they're not as deep for the men to hide in, which can become very, very dangerous. And Paul explains, and he says this several times, that the experienced soldiers know that you can hide behind just a little bit of dirt, but the recruits are becoming more and more of a trouble, because they don't know how to, take those risks and hide behind a bit of dirt that might only be 12, 13, 14 inches high. They're waiting for an actual trench to fall into, and that's not happening because the trenches are getting filled with dirt from all the constant bombardment from the English artillery. And they're kind of living in this really shallow trench, and it's becoming more and more dangerous. And they're noting the different types of artillery that they're experiencing, and their ammunition is it's becoming worse and worse. It's not working properly. They're having to throw harder, throw multiple times in order to get something to work and do things like that. And it's not working in their favor. And this happened, in all honesty, if you look through history, when Germany lost World War One, it was because, and they kind of joke about it, but it's a bit, it runs a bit true that the English army was just better fed. The German army was starving. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough ammunition, and they were just worn out. They could not keep up with the bombardments they were taking. I hope you kind of noticed that too. We're about a good halfway through the book at this point, and it's easy to forget that Paul and his comrades are German. Normally, at least, here we study World War One from the perspective of the United States or England, the ones who won the war. But here we're getting a chance to empathize and sympathize with a German, and realize that, a lot of these young men who were brought into this war had no idea what was going on. They didn't really care. They were just kind of pressured into fighting a war that they really didn't believe in. Eventually, Paul says the food doesn't even last, and they have to tighten their belts a little bit more every day because they're so hungry. They can't sleep at night because of the bombardments. And if you know anything about sleep deprivation, it's very dangerous, and you can start to hallucinate, and things become it becomes very, very difficult to function. So that, on top of no food, on top of poorly operating ammunition and artillery, and they're just kind of done for. They experience claustrophobia, and he explains it, as a man, he kind of goes crazy, and eventually just kind of, he said he collapsed like a rotten tree, and then tries to escape the trenches, and they have to physically tie him down and gag him and bind his arms and stuff so that he doesn't escape, and, they do it to save his life. But, imagine being in a very small trench, just a ditch in the ground with bombs exploding around you, and you have to keep it together. And this young man is having a really, really difficult time keeping it together and tries to escape, and his comrades try to help him and tie him down in order to help him. They try to play some games, card games, things like that, to lighten the mood, to get their mind off of things, but they're stretched thin emotionally, mentally, physically. They're just having a really, really hard time coping this time around because they have had such little rest, and when they're on the front, they can't get sleep at all. They face another bombardment, and this time it's the French. Paul describes, at this point, we're getting a lot of gruesome images. Paul describes, talking about the French, makes it a whole line has gone down before our machine guns. Then we have a lot of stoppages, and they come near. I see one of them, his face upturned, fall into a wire cradle. His body collapses. His hands remain suspended as though he were praying. So what happens is he's being shot down, and he gets caught in some wire, and the rest of his body is shot off, and only his hands remain. And it's kind of a bit gruesome. But Paul, again, his tone here, and remember, tone, it reflects how an author feels about something. And when we have a narrator who is actually participating in the story, and we don't have an omniscient narrator, we see not only the character's attitude towards the story, but our author's attitude as well. And Paul's attitude here is very nonchalant, which gives us the idea that the author wants us to be shocked by this. He wants us to see that, no one should have to or ought to be talking about another person's body being shot off of their arms, and on their arms remaining with such a matter-of-fact attitude. And that shows us how Remarque feels about war itself, and in particular this war. And Remarque uses words a lot, especially in this chapter, things like slaughter, annihilation, things like that, that show his strong feelings about war. And when you read texts like this, that the theme is so evident, and the tone ought to be so evident if you're paying attention. It's really important to notice the diction of the author.